good to hear.
Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And I think the spectacle yesterday in the Oval Office with Vance, Trump, and Zelensky clarified a lot for anybody that still had any doubts about where Donald Trump stands on the question of Ukraine. And by coincidence, but kind of anticipating where we'd be at, we have a guest today who is active in the Ukraine Solidarity campaign in the United Kingdom, and that's Sacha Ismail. He's a British socialist and trade union activist. He's a member of the Fire Brigade Union and Unison, which is a large public sector union of about 1.2 million members. He writes for the socialist paper in the UK, Solidarity, and blogs at South London Socialist. And we'll put the link to that in the chat. And Sacha was a great help to me when I got to London early December in helping me connect with Greens and socialists and trade union activists and Ukraine Solidarity activists, to share our views. He also set up my meeting with Eva Papizinska, the Polish activist in the left-wing Polish party Razem, who we had on this podcast a few weeks ago. And actually, we'll put this in the chat. She gave a nice speech, about 4 minutes, to the Ukraine Solidarity demonstration last weekend, concerning the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Sacha makes a little cameo in there. He's taking pictures, and so he kind of flashes across the screen. So we'll put that in the chat as well. And so, Sacha, welcome. I'm glad we got you here today.
Great to be here.
And why don't we start with your reaction to the confrontation, I don't know what to call it, that Trump and Vance staged with Zelensky yesterday in the Oval Office. As Trump said at the end, it was great television. That's why I think it was a setup. But where do you think that leaves Ukraine and U.S. relations with Ukraine and Russia and Europe?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here, and it was great to connect with you as well, Howie, when you were in London, and glad I was able to be helpful with connecting to other comrades too. So to start with, in terms of the drama in the Oval Office, he's right. It was great television. There's obviously been a lot of speculation about, how much it was planned, what they wanted out of it, why was Vance there, and so on. But I think, regardless of your take on that, and there's been a lot of different, views on that, what it did show clearly is that absolute contempt for Zelensky, but also for the Ukrainian people. So I think the issue with Zelensky is that they have contempt for someone who is relatively politically honest and means what he says. So, I don't say that from the point of view of being a supporter of Zelensky. I regard myself as an opponent of Zelensky. Zelensky's a neoliberal, pro-free market capitalist politician. And I spend a lot of my political time supporting people who, in Ukraine, trade unionists and socialists and so on, who are environmental activists and others who are opposing his policies. But he is, a brave and honest man, I think, in many respects. And I think that the MAGA scumbags do not like that. So that's part of it. I think the second part of it is they have contempt for any people who are oppressed or are facing oppression and are fighting for their freedom. So you see that in their attitude to the Ukrainians. You see it much more openly and blatantly in their attitude to the Palestinian people, but others as well. For instance, the Kurdish people, and I certainly don't think they would have any objection to China invading Taiwan. And I actually haven't looked at what they say about the Uyghurs, for instance, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if they have a similar attitude. So they're certainly, they take the imperialist attitude to any people fighting for their freedom. And for me, that's what the shameful proceedings in that interview really underlined.
So where do you think this leads in terms of, where Europe stands in relation to the U.S. and Russia? I was just on a call with a bunch of European solidarity activists with Ukraine, and they basically say that now it's a two-front struggle for Europe against U.S. imperialism and Russian imperialism, and that if Trump really aligns with Putin, it's not just Ukraine that's in the crossfire, it's all of Europe.
Yeah, I think that's right. The complicating thing about that is that we also, of course, have rising far-right forces in most European countries, which are obviously the third front for those same kind of forces within Europe. But I'll come back to that. I think that clearly there is a struggle to wage in the US. So there's a general social and environmental and working class struggle against the Trump regime. But I think one facet of that is that we should continue to put pressure about what the US government does in terms of Ukraine. So, I'd still be in favor of, the US government sending military aid to Ukraine. I think that's still a relevant demand. But clearly that possibility is retreating. So I think the question about what Europe does become a lot more important now, a lot more important. And at the moment, it's kind of ambiguous what Europe's going to do. So there's a lot of talk about, for instance, about peacekeepers. But I think it's problematic in some ways, because I think as socialists and anti-imperialists, we should want to, as much as possible, avoid a direct confrontation between the Western powers and Russia. But also it's pie in the sky, because they're talking about peacekeepers when, after a peace deal. So the question comes back to how is there going to be a peace deal? How do you get a peace deal, and what kind of peace deal is it going to be? So this is typical Keir Starmer, just evading all the real issues. So I think that our demand should be nothing to do with European troops in Ukraine, but that European governments give the weapons and aid to Ukraine that needs Russia. Really, it can win comprehensively, but at the very least, it can win the most favourable terms possible for a peace settlement. That would be perfectly possible. But at the moment, bourgeois governments in Europe that doesn't seem to be where the debate is at. So I think the Labour movement and left and Ukraine solidarity activists have to try and shift the debate in that direction. And it would, it would be perfectly possible for that. It would be a step for European governments to fill the gap in US military aid, but it'd be perfectly possible. Actually, it would be less expensive than some of the general military rearmament programs they're talking about. And from a socialist point of view, an internationalist point of view, much better that they help the Ukrainians to defeat Russia than that we see a general expansion of military spending and militarism. There is another aspect to it which is a bit complicated, which is the question about, I think, the possibility for winning stronger support for Ukraine in European countries also relates a lot to the internal policy of those European countries. So if we have a situation where European governments continue to implement austerity, i.e. cuts in public services and public expenditure and attacks on living standards of workers and the working class, then it's going to be, that much harder, well, morally legitimate, but also that much harder to win public support for continued and stepped up aid to Ukraine. And actually, we've got that problem in the UK for sure, where we have a Labour Party government that is not, at the moment, is not willing to tax the rich in order to rebuild public services, and may even have to make further cuts. On its current trajectory, may have to make further cuts to public services. But also, there's a new aspect in the last few days, which is that they're now talking about cutting foreign aid, so overseas development assistance, in order to fund increased military spending, which is a morally bankrupt policy, but actually also plays into the hands of Russia and other authoritarian states, and I think will only undermine support for Ukraine. So we have to have a battle. There's a battle about the aid that our governments give to Ukraine, but there's also a battle about the internal policy of our governments, which is very much related to that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and these governments are getting together on Monday at Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister's invitation. But I just learned on this European Ukraine Solidarity Network meeting, that the Baltic states are not invited. What do you make of that?
I mean, I didn't know that. So who is invited? You tell me. I think you may know more than me, or may have just paid more attention than me.
Yeah, I think it's the major EU states, Germany, France, the UK, Poland, and I don't know who else, but apparently the Baltic states are not invited.
Well, these are in many ways some of the most doubtful allies Ukraine has in Europe. And I mean, for a range of reasons, but perfectly understandable reasons, the Baltic states and also some of the Scandinavian countries are clear allies to Ukraine. So I think, we'll see what comes out of this summit, but I think that we should be in favour of a wider summit of any European government that wants to proactively support Ukraine to discuss how we can help Ukraine win. So we'll see, but I would not expect necessarily that much clear out of this. I mean, in the UK, we are discussing about ramping up campaigning as Ukraine Solidarity campaign. Sorry, I should say. We are discussing with others in the Labour movement and left who take a pro-Ukraine perspective about ramping up solidarity campaigning, and specifically with demands getting the Labour movement, trade unions, but also Labour Party MPs and others to place demands on the Labour government about support for Ukraine. So we're going to be developing those demands in the coming weeks. And obviously that will be shaped by what comes out of this summit. But if I'm honest, I wouldn't necessarily expect at this point that much out of it.
So what's your sense of Europe's capacity to fill the gaps in aid to Ukraine if the U.S. reduces or stops aid? And really, we've already cut off the humanitarian aid through U.S. aid, which has affected millions of displaced people, refugees, hundreds of thousands, HIV, AIDS people, and on and on. I mean, it's been a real.
But Howie, that's one of the aspects about, I think I mentioned that Starmer has aped that policy. So, in the wake of Trump announcing that, you would not, well, maybe you would expect, but you certainly wouldn't hope that the British Labour government would announce a very similar policy. And actually, when the shutting down or effective shutting down of US aid was announced, the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy was critical of it. Yet they've now done very similar in the UK. So there's a large element of them, not only refusing to fight Trumpism, but actually copying many of its policies, which is particularly disgraceful. And we'll see what fight there can be about that in the Labour movement. It's very interesting. There's a woman called Annalisa Dodds, who is a Labour Party politician who until it must be even 2 days ago, was the International Development Minister. Who is very much a loyalist. I actually went to university with her, so I used to know her. But she's very much a loyalist, and she has resigned in protest at Starmer's policy on cutting foreign aid. So I think there is going to be a lot of revulsion around this, both in the Labour Party and the trade unions. Not to mention the wider left. So we're obviously going to have to challenge that and kind of connect that to the pro-Ukrainian cause as well. But I'm sorry, that's interrupting your question. But I did just want to emphasise that point, that we're in a situation where, certainly in the UK, we have social democratic politicians who, it's not just that they're failing to effectively fight Trumpism, they're actually kind of in many ways copying elements of Trumpism. And that relates not only to the power of the American government, but also, for instance, to our rising Trumpite type party in the UK, which is called Reform UK. So I'm not saying the Labour Party or social democracy are just the same as the Trumpites, but I'm saying that we do have this real problem that they're bending under that pressure, and we have to organise in the broader left, but also in the trade unions and the Labour Party to organise a fight back. But that actually wasn't your question. Your question was about European capacity to make up the military aid.
Yeah, and let's get to that. I just want to comment that I was pretty disgusted with the way Starmer from the UK and Macron from France came to, Trump and normalized him. 100%. Trump is a fascist. I mean, these people need to recognize that Trump is their enemy, even if they are, spineless liberals, as we call them in this country. The Democrats, that's been their strategy to deal with Trumpism. It's like, meet it halfway. Biden talked about bipartisanship with a Republican Party that was going fascist. And, like on immigration,
I was literally about to say immigration. It's the same here, 100%. And that is obviously a kind of decisive issue for the rise of the far right. It's the immigration issue, and centrist and even social democratic parties have normalized that discourse. I totally agree.
Yeah. So, and our experience shows that is not the way to fight fascism. You end up normalizing, legitimizing it, making Trump seem like a normal politician, and the MAGA Republicans. And, if they're doing that with in the UK, that's, I think, a recipe for getting beat. So what I was getting at with the aid, one of the things I heard on this European network called Catherine Samary of France, and I haven't checked these numbers, but she said, in terms of military aid to Ukraine, she said, well, in terms of Ukraine's military capacity, half of it has come from within Ukraine. They've been producing their own weapons, ammunition, drones. 30% has come from.
Yeah, they've really developed the drone. For instance, the drone industry in Ukraine has apparently been massively developed. Yeah,
so she said it was 50% Ukraine internally, 30% from Europe combined, and 20% from the US. So, what I was going to ask you is, do you think Europe has the capacity to step in when you consider also that the EU has a gross domestic product 15 times that of Russia?
Yeah, well, you've kind of answered the question for me, but yes. I mean, look, one of the things about the Trump meeting with Zelensky is that they repeated this, I believe it was in that meeting, they repeated this lie about how much the US has given to Ukraine. They keep saying 350 billion. And yeah, they're just not so much distorting as inventing the figures. So, I think the figures you've cited show that clearly. Europe is a rich continent and there is plenty of wealth. But it comes down again in a way to two things, like I sort of touched on before. The first is political will to do it, where it seems that, support for Ukraine is not in any way really even an anti-capitalist demand, but it seems to have kind of slipped outside the bourgeois consensus. So how do we push it back into that consensus and get that political will? But then the second question is how that relates to the internal social policy of the European states, where we have a situation where you do have austerity, you do have cuts in public services. In the UK, at least, you now have cuts in foreign development aid. So we need to challenge all those things and fight for maintained and increased military aid to Ukraine in that wider context of fighting for wider beneficial social spending. That's the challenge. How do we create that political will, and how do we, put it into a broader social framework? And that obviously comes back to how do we mobilize the labour movement, which is difficult after a long period where our movements have been in retreat, but that's what we have to do. So I guess what I'm saying in a way is, yes, but we need to pose that, we need to pose that necessary aid for Ukraine as a distinct demand, but we also need to not separate it off too absolutely from the kind of wider battles we need to have about the policy of our governments, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Why don't we turn now to the minerals deal that this meeting that happened yesterday was supposed to be about? I looked at it as really a protection racket that Trump was trying to run on Ukraine. Give us your minerals and maybe we'll give you aid. And I'll just tell you my opinion, I think he's not going to get a peace deal, and he's mad about it. And he blamed Zelensky. But I think Putin's already told him, we're not conceding anything. And, basically Ukraine has to surrender before we'll agree to anything. And Trump is realizing, he can't sell that to Ukraine in the first place and to the public in general. So now he's looking for a scapegoat, and it was Zelensky. But just the minerals deal in general, what is your take on that?
Well, I think you've largely covered it, but obviously the earlier drafts were worse, but the final draft, which as I understand it, for now, that has now been nixed as well. But the final draft was still very much taking Ukrainian resources with very little in return. So it is it is a shift of US policy towards a more openly imperialist attitude and relationship towards Ukraine, and it's definitely something we should oppose. I think so. I mean, if that's not revived, that I think in many ways that's good, and we need to argue for European aid to Ukraine as the alternative to that. I think that there is a wider problem, which is a question about the whole nature of aid to Ukraine and how that relates to the reconstruction of Ukraine, which is even before Trumpism, the general policy of European and North American capitalist states and Ukraine's other allies is to push for a reconstruction that would, well, an economic policy during the war, but also a reconstruction that is in the interest of international capitalism. And the Ukrainian government, unfortunately, which is very much a neoliberal government, is very happy to go along with that. So, there are many countries where, at least for tactical reasons during the war, for instance, you have an expansion of public provision. That has not been, social services and so on, that's not been the case in Ukraine, where, for instance, you've had widespread shutting down of health services and hospitals, even during the war. When I was in Ukraine 2 years ago, we visited a hospital which had just been kept open by a union campaign, but that was, and we did fundraising for that afterwards, for that hospital as Ukraine Solidarity campaign. But that was in the context of a whole wave of hospital closures, where most of those hospitals had not been kept open. That partly reflects the character of the Ukrainian government, but it also reflects the policy that's coming from Ukraine's allies. So we know that in the UK, the Conservative government that we had until July last year actively promoted, and the evidence of that became public, actively promoted attacks on trade union rights and workers' rights in Ukraine. Now, the policy of our Labour government is less explicitly, anti-worker in that respect, but it's still neoliberal policy. So I think we do need to challenge the whole framework of the economic policy that the Ukrainian government promotes and that Ukraine's allies are promoting. And the start point of that is to link up with trade unions and other progressive social movements in Ukraine, and help develop their demands and amplify those demands. So to give you one example of how we could do that, there was last year there was a Ukraine Reconstruction Conference in London where really any kind of Ukrainian social movement was excluded from participation. And we, as the Ukraine Solidarity campaign in the UK, worked with Ukrainian organisations and other partners in the UK to organise an alternative conference alongside that, where we heard from Ukrainian labour movement and social movement speakers, and we tried to give voice to and a platform to and amplify their demands. So I think that the minerals deal, yes, I'm not at all saying yes, this is just the same, nothing's changed. Absolutely, this represents a shift in a more imperialist and predatory direction. But I think to challenge that, we have to kind of expose the whole nature of the economic policy that Ukraine's allies are promoting and that the Zelensky government is promoting. We have to try and shift the debate in a different direction, hard as that is. In other words, it's not just enough to say support Ukraine. It's about supporting Ukraine and then supporting a social struggle within Ukraine about the kind of country Ukraine is going to be. Which for us as socialists is not a difficult argument, right? That's always the approach we've taken to national liberation struggles. But obviously we have to explain that to people. And some of that is discussion of that with comrades in Ukraine as well. Some of whom are socialists, but some of whom may not be.
Just on the Ukraine deal, I got a statement. I mean, the minerals deal. I got a statement that I'll try to get around the U.S. and I'll send you a copy, Sacha, from the Green Party of Ukraine, opposing the minerals deal.
That would be great to read. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically saying the U.S. wants Ukraine to pay reparations to the U.S. And that's not going to really help with their reconstruction. So you talked about reaching out to the labor movement. Why don't you describe to people how the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in the UK works with the unions to a much larger extent than progressive movements in the US do? You do have a Labor Party, which historically has been tied to the unions, and it's in a different way than the Democrats, who get them union support but don't do anything for the unions. So anyway, that relationship's much deeper, and just talk about all the activities, because I know you've done not just educational work, but material aid and so forth.
Yeah, okay. Look, I mean, it's slightly harder for me to comment on, you know, your situation in the US. Obviously, I do follow it, but I will try and say something about our situation here. So, okay, so the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign is a trade union-based and progressive and, in broad sense, socialist campaign in support of the Ukrainian labour movement. And I say in broad sense socialist, not because I have any hesitation about socialism, but because obviously in the campaign we have people coming from a variety of different left-wing perspectives, be that Marxist, different kinds of socialists, social democrats, anarchists, Green Party activists of various persuasions. But we are in the broad sense a socialist campaign, certainly a labour movement campaign. So the campaign was set up long before I was really actively involved in 2013, 2014. So this was at the time of the initial Russian military intervention in eastern Ukraine. So the intervention in Donetsk and Luhansk and the military seizure of Crimea. But also, so that was one side of things that was going on, but also at the same time a wave of attacks on the rights of Ukrainian workers, both by the Russian connected authorities in the east of the country, but also by Ukrainian oligarchs further west in the Ukrainian government. So the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign was founded by socialists and trade unionists to expose the nature of the Russian intervention in Ukraine, but also and to defend Ukraine's national independence, but also to more broadly support the social rights of the Ukrainian people as well as their national rights. And in the first instance, to do that through linking up with trade unions in Ukraine and workers' struggles in Ukraine. And I mean, I was a supporter of the campaign from the start, but I wasn't so involved. I didn't really get very actively involved until the end of 2021. But I do remember back in 2013, 2014, it was a hard argument in the British labour movement. So we had a rival campaign that was on the other side of things, that was kind of promoting the pro-Russian narrative effectively. And it did win a certain amount of support in the trade unions, and a lot of people who should know better were kind of buying into a lot of Russian propaganda and disinformation. It was an uphill battle. That has shifted a lot in ways I'll describe. So the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign isn't new. It didn't come about in 2022. It's been building for a long time, including in the unions, and that's part of it. That's an important part of the picture. So obviously that activity stepped up a great deal at the end of 2021 and into 2022, and after that, which is when I became actively involved, more actively involved in the campaign. And obviously the nature of the events in Ukraine, the full-scale Russian invasion, the crisis in Ukrainian politics and world politics around that invasion, through the question of Ukraine into much wider and sharper focus in the British labour movement and left. So those debates were revived, and part of what we tried to do as a campaign was about, as you said, about practical aid. So we, had long-established links with trade unionists and socialists in Ukraine, both major Ukrainian union federations. So the Federation of Unions of Ukraine, FPU, and the Confederation of Free Trade Unions of Ukraine, KVPU. Also socialist organisations such as Social Movement, other various local union organisations and others. So we, right from the start of full-scale invasion, we stepped up our efforts to organise practical aid, which was usually connected to some group of workers who were actively involved in the struggle against the invasion, whether that was trade unionists who had gone into the army. So on a number of occasions, for instance, we raised money to fund vehicles to go to particular brigades where there were a group of workers who had previously been in a trade union together or were union members from a particular union and were in a particular bit of the Ukrainian army, and they're so stretched that they were requesting a vehicle or other equipment for their brigade, and we would raise funds for that and for instance, purchase vehicles and deliver them. So when I went to Ukraine in 2023, we delivered a vehicle to go to a brigade in eastern Ukraine. We also took over medical supplies and other equipment. We've just finished running an appeal for firefighting and rescue workers in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine near the front line, which is workers in the same industry I'm in. I'm a fire safety worker in London Fire Brigade. So we raised a lot of money for that in the trade unions, including my union. So we've done a whole series of projects like that, which have raised many hundreds, thousands of pounds worth of funding for aid, as well as direct donations of vehicles, equipment, and so on. And we've developed that over the last 3 years. So that's one side of our work. Another side of our work is about, as I said, the question of Ukraine came into much kind of more general and sharper focus because of the invasion. And so every union pretty much in the UK discussed what it thought about it. And we've been involved in organising and, I suppose more importantly, helping workers in different unions organise their own organised Ukraine solidarity groups to do practical aid work, but also to fight about what their union policy is, both about what it's saying politically and about what it's what the unions themselves do in terms of practical aid. Because obviously, when unions organise aid, you can do it on a much bigger scale. So those political arguments, we think that those two things, political arguments and the aid work, are very much intertwined, because winning the clear political positions in the unions is crucial for mobilising aid on a larger scale. And on the other hand, the aid work is, itself, as well as vital practical solidarity, it's also a form of political propaganda. So we've done those two things alongside each other. And I think largely there's a lot more that needs to be done and could be done, but I think we have been relatively successful. So I think there is no trade union, with one exception, which I'll come on to, in which we have lost so British unions generally have their national conferences basically in spring and summer, so between April and July. So the conference season is about to begin again. And each year we've been involved in arguments and motions being put forward at those conferences. And in every case, either our motions have been passed, or if we haven't been able to get our motions onto the agenda due to bureaucratic manoeuvres from the people promoting a campist view, which is that's happened in a number of cases. In those cases, we were able to get their motions voted down, which is quite a shock to the system for them. The only union in which that wasn't the case was the University and College Union, which is the higher and further education union, so post-16 education. And last year at their congress, the campus position won very narrowly. And in response to that, we were organising with a group of workers in that union who wanted a clear pro-Ukraine position. They organised their network and built it up. They also organised practical aid initiatives. And this year, we came back at the congress. Sorry, not this year, last year now. We came back at the congress, and the Ukraine solidarity motion, after a very sharp and heated argument, the Ukraine solidarity motion passed, and the Congress voted in a specific vote to affiliate to our campaign, as well as vote for a motion to take a clear position and support practical aid work. And that's meant that's opened up, for instance, to develop that example. That's opened up that union supporting a number of practical initiatives. And to give one example, at the demonstration we had, which you mentioned last Saturday, that union formally brought its banner on the demonstration and then sent a speaker from their national executive to speak in the rally at the end of the demonstration outside the Russian embassy, which was very gratifying, because one of the things in his speech he read out the policy we passed at the Congress last year. So we do a lot of that work as well. And a big win for us in that respect was again last summer. So you mentioned that I'm in two unions. I'm in the Fire Brigade union, which is a small specific fire and rescue union, but I'm also in Unison, which is the giant public sector union that covers the public sector. And Unison had never debated Ukraine at its conference, because basically the campist forces on the left blocked that discussion 2 years in a row. But we helped comrades in that union set up a Ukraine Solidarity Caucus, and we again organised political campaigning as well as aid initiatives. And we got a motion finally to the conference last year, and we won, very substantially, probably 3/4 of the vote, which again has opened up the possibility to do a lot more work among the branches and members of that union, as well as some support from the union nationally. So that was a very big win for us. So we continue to do that kind of work, and we think it's not just a matter of passing motions. It's about what the motions say politically, and the propaganda value of that in terms of moral support for the Ukrainian cause, and it's also about opening the way to wider practical solidarity. So yeah, we do put a lot of emphasis on that work, and there's a number of there's a number of union conferences coming up where we haven't had motions before, or where, for one reason or another, something has not yet been passed. We're hoping that, you know, clearer policy will be passed this year, and we've got more organised, you know, more organised caucuses in more unions now. We're trying to do more of that. You know, some of these are quite small caucuses, but they are still self-organised groups of workers within different unions that are organising specifically around the issue of Ukraine. So that's very important for us. Happy to say more about that.
Yeah, I think it's useful for Americans to hear that, because our progressive movements don't relate to the unions that much, or they see them as hopelessly bureaucratic and conservative, when in fact, you know, particularly at the local level, you can begin. And there are parts of the country, the San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, you have a lot of progressive initiatives in the unions, but not so much in other parts of the country. But it's something that we can do. I think another thing I took away from that is your Ukraine Solidarity campaign got started in 2014, late 2013. American left didn't even wake up till the full-scale invasion. I mean, you had some people talking about it, but there was no organization. And I think that speaks to our insular nature, not just Americans generally, but also on the left. So, you know, that's good.
It's close to time for us as well. But yes, absolutely. I mean, Ukraine Solidarity campaign was a very small campaign for a number of years, but it was a group of people who recognised the importance of what was happening and did organise around it consistently. And it meant that when the invasion became imminent, we had a core of people that could then expand quite rapidly. And I think that is important. But I think what you say about the unions is absolutely right. Like, people need to throw themselves in, whether that's, you know, taking their own unions more seriously, whether it's, if they're looking for what they're going to do to make a living, finding a place that they can be active in a union, whether it's reaching out to other people's unions. You know, from a socialist point of view, unions, whatever their failings, are the core of the organised movement of the working class. And any serious progressive, let alone socialist organising, needs to relate to them. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yes, I think American progressives and lefties are still learning that. Coming out of the 60s, on civil rights, and particularly Vietnam, the unions were slow or on the wrong side. And the next generation of activists kind of wrote them off, which was not all of us, but, you know, a lot of the movement did. And it's weakened us, because you're right. Those are still the biggest progressive organizations, or potentially progressive organizations. Union dues are $6 billion of revenue in the United States a year. And, you know, we just can't let them hand that over to the Democrats to the extent they do political work.
But I think that, I mean, a couple of things. One is that, you know, you mentioned like the Bay Area and other areas where there are important initiatives. Clearly, more widely, there are interesting things going on in your labour movement. You know, you've had strikes and struggles there. For instance, some of the auto workers' struggles. You know, obviously you have labour notes. I know some socialists would have some criticisms of, but actually there are signs of life in your movement as well recently, and we some of us here take inspiration from that as well. So it's not that it's a dead landscape you can't relate to, not at all. I think the other thing I want to say is that we do have the advantage that in the UK labour movement there is more residual culture of people thinking of themselves as socialists. So, you know, the leaders of kind of almost all the unions would, not all, but, you know, the vast bulk of the unions would call themselves socialists. So that is an advantage, but a lot of it is quite skin deep. You know, it really is quite, you know, the difference of that from mainstream democratic liberalism is not so great. Even with the Corbyn movement and the Labour Party, a lot of it was really not very politically advanced. So we do have some advantages, but I wouldn't want to overstate it.
Okay, we put in the chat a link to the fundraising we're doing for generators for people in Ukraine that will be distributed by the miners union and the railway workers union. We're 3/4 of the way to how much we want to raise on GoFundMe. So please check that out and make a donation if you can. There's I don't know if we're going to get through everything we need to in an hour, but let's just go to comments and questions from the chat so we get some of those in. And Chris will post them in the screen. BD Dimmitt, Zelensky's early stance was that he wanted Ukraine to be rebuilt with a decentralized power grid that was all renewables.
Do you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, if you have something to say, sure.
I mean, I don't know anything about that, but I would say that really right from the start, Zelensky has been very strongly neoliberal. So I would guess that maybe the kind of version of that he had in mind was quite a neoliberal version of it. So I don't know, but I would maybe be skeptical that represented a progressive stance.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that because I've worked with Svetlana Romanko with Razum We Stand, which has been pushing for strengthening fossil fuel sanctions on Russia and rebuilding Ukraine around renewable energy. And you're right, Zelensky's such a neoliberal, you can only imagine it through the private sector. But the government is giving out contracts and they're being lobbied by Western giant corporations that want to rebuild big power plants, thermal power plants, coal-fired or gas-fired, because they'll get big contracts and they're lobbying the Ukrainian government. And people like Svetlana have been lobbying the Ukrainian government. And the argument is not only is renewables needed for climate protection, they're more resilient against Russian attacks. You have a big thermal plant gets knocked out and you knock out a whole big section of power. And if you have a centralized grid, you're in big trouble. Whereas with wind and solar, it's decentralized generation. You could have microgrids so the whole grid doesn't collapse. It takes a lot more bombs to wipe out windmills and solar panel fields than it does a power plant. So that argument is going on. And it's actually been written up in the New York Times about the struggle over that question. So that's where that's at. And I don't know if Zelensky's stance has changed since he called for renewables, but it definitely, promoting it on a neoliberal basis. In other words, let the private sector do it and we'll, cheer them. Vicky Corden, I'm very concerned that if Ukraine does not get help, Putin could invade a NATO country. And when Article 5 is activated, it'll lead to a bigger war. Putin needs to be stopped.
Yeah, I mean, so we have some of our leftists in Britain basically oppose the Ukrainian struggle and aid for Ukraine on the grounds that this will provoke a third world war. Whereas my view is, and certainly Ukraine Solidarity Ukraine's view is similar to yours, which is actually the best way to stop a wider conflict is to help the Ukrainians win. So yeah, if we want to stop a third world war, but even the spreading of the conflict in Europe, then the best way to do that is to help the Ukrainians win as quickly as possible by giving them the weapons and the aid that they need to do that, to push Russia out and to defang, at least to some extent, Russian imperialism. So yes, I agree with you.
And that's what Trump said yesterday in that confrontation in the Oval Office. He's accusing Zelensky of starting World War III.
Well, and the other night I had the misfortune of listening in for an hour to a meeting of our Stop the War Coalition, which is the kind of campist left anti-war organization here. And Medea Benjamin was speaking, and she actually explicitly said, it's fantastic what Trump has said. The word fantastic was the word she used. So, yeah.
She posted a video right after this confrontation in the Oval Office on the Code Pink Facebook page saying Trump is right.
Yeah.
I mean, she basically is telling Ukraine, surrender, give Putin what he wants, so I don't have to go through World War III. It's a pacifism that's fascist or appeasing fascist. It's like telling Poland to let Hitler take part of Poland so you don't have World War II.
Yeah,
that's actually Putin said that in his speech. He said it in the Tucker Carlson interview. It's insane, and it's not progressive.
I mean, the slightly more subtle campists that we have made the argument that, this shows that US imperialism turning against Ukraine shows that Ukraine should never have accepted Western aid because you can't rely on imperialism. But obviously it's an absurd argument, because the logic of it would be that it would be better for the Ukrainians if Ukraine had been crushed in 2022, because they would have somehow maintain their anti-imperialist purity. And it makes, as socialists, it makes no sense at all. As socialists, we obviously argue that we don't want Ukraine to be dependent on Western imperialist powers either. But the reality is they needed to defeat the Russian invasion, and they had to get weapons from somewhere, and this is where they could get weapons from. It'd be much better if we had a socialist, international arsenal where we could, give them weapons, but we didn't. So that was the option, and it's not, of course, it's not at all unprecedented in history. I mean, the two cases that I regularly cite, and I never get an answer from any of these people. One is the Vietnam War, where, of course, the Vietnamese got extensive military aid from the Soviet Union and China. From what I understand, much more extensive than what the Ukrainians have got, including troops. Apparently, there are actually quite a lot of Ukrainian, Soviet Ukrainian troops fighting in Vietnam. So, I believe the Soviet Union and China were imperialist powers, but in fact, not long after the Vietnam War, China invaded Vietnam. But I'm still glad that they helped the Vietnamese defeat the US, despite the fact I, would not have liked the North Vietnamese government. And the other example, which is very close to home for me, in a sense, because my family and background on one side is Bangladeshi, is the Bangladeshi national independence struggle, the Liberation War in 1971, which was heavily armed by India and indirectly by the Soviet Union, and where the Bengalis only eventually won because of direct Indian military intervention, which actually led to many problems once Bangladesh became independent. And yet I'm glad that India, for its own reasons, helped Bangladesh defeat Pakistan in its blood-soaked war against the Bengali people. So this is not unprecedented, and there's many other examples as well in history. But unfortunately, we have a left which is politically and historically illiterate and doesn't want to have these debates.
Yeah, as a veteran of the anti-Vietnam War movement, I mean, we never told the Vietnamese to stop fighting. Or you get these arguments from people like Medea Benjamin that the Ukrainians can't win. The Russians put that out there too. Therefore, they should surrender. We never told that to the Vietnamese. Our position was the U.S. had no business being there. U.S. troops out.
Yeah.
And instead of saying Russian troops out, which Code Pink actually had as a demand in their first demonstration the week after the invasion and then dropped it, Russia has no business in Ukraine. So our demand should be Russian troops out. There's nothing to negotiate there. It's just the demand that we should support. It's the right thing.
Howie, you tell me, but I'm assuming that no one dreamt of, including anti-Stalinist socialists, I'm sure no one dreamt of saying that the Soviet Union and China should stop arming the Vietnamese.
Yes, I mean there were some dogmatic pacifists that said that, but
yeah, sure. But leftists,
they were so marginal. The movement was U.S. troops out. Now was the demand.
Yeah. By the way, while you're looking at another question, I would like to come back a little bit more about how Ukraine Solidarity Campaign is organised. If there's time, sure. I'll come back on that later.
No, why don't you do that now?
Well, I was just going to say that there was a bit more I should have said before, but so we have union affiliations. So there are unions we work with on various struggles that are not affiliated to us formally. So, for instance, the GMB, which is a large union. It's the third largest union with over 500,000 members, which is both private and public sector. And we've worked with them on quite a few different struggles, but they're not formally affiliated to us. But we do have affiliations from 5 national unions, as well as like a wide range of what you call locals, so local union branches, and also like city trades councils, so city confederations of union branches, regions of unions, and so on. In terms of the 5 national unions that are affiliated, the unions we have are Unison, which is the biggest union in the UK, which is general public sector. ASLEF, which is the train drivers union. UCU, which is the higher and further education union. So as I said, that's a union where we lost in 2023 and came back and won in 2024. Let me see. PCS, which is central government civil servants, so like the equivalent of your federal workers unions. And then the NUM, which is the National Union of Mine Workers, which is a small union now, but was historically one of the kind of great bastions of the British Labour movement, and has very extensive links with mining unions in Ukraine, where mining is still a very important industry. So those are our 5 unions we have affiliated nationally. So those national affiliates, as well as various labor movement political organisations and Ukrainian organisations that are affiliated to the campaign, have seats on our steering committee. So our steering committee is a mix of people elected to our AGM and affiliates from those organisations, in particular unions. So that's important for us to, in terms of kind of the nature of the campaign we're building, and we try and win more and more affiliations we can all the time, both local and national, as well as, you know, changing the policy of unions, organising more practical aid, organising union support for different struggles, and also, as I said, caucuses. You know, we don't just want to organise everything from our steering committee. We try and encourage the creation of caucuses in the different unions in order to take that work forward.
B.D. Dimmitt, Trump is standing on the offer that the U.S. will secure Ukraine's borders and sovereignty if Ukraine gives Russia a large portion of fossil fuel resources and gives the U.S. claim to the rare minerals and such. I think he means Ukraine gives the U.S. He doesn't seem to think it ironic that the entire Russian invasion back to seizing Crimea and the Donbass happened, quote unquote, on our watch, which means Trump's watch, as we are already committed to securing those two things for Ukraine a quarter century ago, which I guess would refer to the Budapest Memorandum.
Absolutely, and of course, not only the Western states, but also Russia was committed to. I mean, this is the irony: Russia in that deal committed to respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and defending it against threats. So, you know, the whole thing is incredible. That's one side of it. The other side of it is that, of course, this sends a terrible signal in terms of nuclear disarmament. I mean, I imagine, you know, of course, yourself, Howie, but listeners to the podcast, and certainly myself, you know, have come up on the whole struggle against nuclear weapons. You know, that was one of the very first political issues I was involved with as a young activist. And you know, what kind of signal does it send if one of the very few countries in the world to have got rid of its nuclear weapons on the basis of you know, its sovereignty being recognised is then unable to defend itself? You know, we should still oppose nuclear weapons, but this is, you know, it really undercuts the ground on which we're standing in terms of that struggle even further than where it already is. So, yeah, we absolutely need to talk about the Budapest Memorandum and the shameful betrayal of it and how Ukraine has been betrayed. You know, even prior to the latest term with Trump, you know, Ukraine has been treated very shabbily, obviously by Russia, but also actually by its allies.
And that's going to lead to nuclear proliferation because people around the world are looking at this.
Yeah.
And for the same reason that people looked at Iran and Libya dropping their nuclear weapons programs in Iraq, and they all got invaded or attacked. So North Korea got arms. Now they're looking at Ukraine and saying, we need nuclear arms. And so you hear it from Poland, you hear it from Japan, from South Korea. A lot of countries are saying we need nuclear arms to defend ourselves, particularly now that the countries I just mentioned don't feel they have the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So this whole thing is promoting nuclear proliferation.
Yeah. And of course, also promoting more widely the idea of like imperialist impunity. Like, I think there's very little doubt for me that what Russia has got away with in Ukraine is not unrelated to what Israel has felt able to do against the Palestinians in the last 2 years, and the last year and a half in particular. And you know, we do live now in a world of we've always lived in this world, but we live in it to a growing degree of imperialist impunity, and I think that cannot be a matter of indifference for anti-imperialists and socialists. We have to push back against it.
Scout Trooper 164, do you think the idea of Europe kicking the U.S. out of NATO and replacing it with Ukraine will happen or not, or a middle ground?
Well, I don't know about that, but I do think, I mean, the problem is, are European governments willing to challenge Trump, you know, at all before you get to questions about NATO. I mean, I think there are genuine dilemmas about what we say about the question of NATO, but certainly this is speaking for myself rather than for the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. I've always been against NATO and been for Britain getting out of NATO and for the disbandment of NATO. Whether you foreground that right now is another question, but I think for me the starting point is European governments, and particularly social democratic governments, need to be pushed to stand up against Trump. In the UK, we see a situation where our government is absolutely kowtowing to the Trump regime. I mean, Starmer's visit to Trump a few days ago could not be in starker contrast to Zelensky's bravery, where Starmer was absolutely crawling to Trump, and where he's gone out of his way to basically tell his ministers who have previously been very sharply critical of Trump, including actually our foreign secretary, to shut up and to walk back what they've said. So I think the starting point is that governments need to stand up to Trump and Trumpism.
D.D. Dimmitt, Biden's approach to boosting the bottom lines of our weapons manufacturers by giving Ukraine large quantities of destructive potential carried the caveat that you can only use them to destroy your homeland, has set things up for Trump to come in as a vulture, just like he's doing in Gaza.
I'm not sure I quite follow that question or that point.
Well, the argument is when we spend money on weapons for Ukraine, a lot of it goes to U.S. arms manufacturers. So it never does get to Ukraine. And we give it to Ukraine and then tell them they can only use it to attack Russian military assets in Ukraine, not hit assets in Russia that are being used against Ukraine. And so, you know, the parallel is Israel destroyed Gaza, and now Trump wants to come in and turn it into a resort area and kick the Palestinians out. So there are parallels there, I think he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think on Gaza, yeah, clearly the struggle against the ethnic cleansing of Gaza on one hand and the offensive in the West Bank on the other is absolutely crucial. And then, you know, we have to keep alive the horizon of there being a democratic solution where there's self-determination, both, again, this is speaking for myself, necessarily rather than the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, but self-determination for both the Palestinian people and the Israeli Jews. So I think that's crucial. Yeah, look, from a socialist point of view, we would, if there has to be a defence industry, even under capitalism, we would want it to be publicly owned and not run on the basis of profit and democratically controlled. That's obviously not where we're at the moment, and the Ukrainians didn't have any choice about where they could get weapons from. But it's also true that if you're against war and destruction, the best way to put a stop to that would be for Ukraine to win as quickly as possible. And there are many points in the last 3 years where if Ukraine had been provided with the weapons it needed and was asking for, this war could have been over much more quickly and on a progressive basis. So I think that still has to be our perspective, that it should not be about European troops in Ukraine. As I said before, it should be about Ukrainians getting the weapons they need to defeat Russia, or at least significantly push it back. And that's what we're certainly going to be raising as Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in the UK and Europe in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, well, Sacha, our hour is up, and we didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully people got a lot out of this. Let's put in the chat another thing that I think people should be aware of. It's from the Canadian Green Party, and it's basically they're worried that Trump's going to invade Canada, so they're calling for an increase in defense spending by Canada to protect them in the case the U.S. comes in militarily. The Canadians are taking this serious, and maybe we should too. So let's see.
I think in USC in the UK we probably have different views about increased defence spending. It's something we have different views and debates about. But I think where we'd be united is that the best and most progressive and actually also cheapest way to stop a wider global conflict is to help Ukraine win. I did also want to say just quickly, 2 things I put in the chat is 2 appeals we've been running. So one is the Donetsk Oblast Rescue Workers appeal I mentioned, which is the bottom one. And the other one is raising money for a union-established social centre in eastern Ukraine that supports displaced people, but it also produces camouflage netting to protect soldiers at the front. And we're fundraising for special materials they need for that production of that camouflage. So please do consider donating to one of those appeals. And so, feel free to circulate them as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll just say on the Canadian thing, I'm sharing it for people's information, not necessarily endorsing the policies, although it's a long list of policies, I think some of which we would support, including solidarity with Ukraine. But, people can take a look at that. So next week, I think we'll just have questions and answers. It's been over a month since we did that. There's so much to talk about with all the, the electronic coup with Musk, the firing of all these federal officials, the, rounding up of undocumented immigrants for deportation, the problems in Guantanamo that some of these people that have been rounded up are now facing. And of course, the big change in U.S. position in the world and its relationship to Europe and Russia and Ukraine, not to mention Gaza and the West Bank and Israel and that whole situation. So there's a lot to talk about. So next week we'll do that. And then the following week we will have Arthur Pai, who is with the Rojava Information Center. He's been with the movement in Rojava, the Kurdish grassroots democratic feminist autonomous governed region, which now is under assault by Turkey, and its relationship to the new government in Damascus is up in the air. So that'll be an interesting discussion. And what the U.S. does in relation to that, because we have 1,000 troops there and have been allies with the Kurds against ISIS. So there's a lot to talk about there. So those things are coming up. And Sacha, any last words before we sign off?
No, I mean, just to say, just to say thank you again for having me. It's a real pleasure to come on. I hope we'll, stay in touch and hopefully, strengthen our ties between internationalists in the US and the UK. One thing I should say is we have an American comrade coming over to the UK to speak, which is a woman called, at the end of March, who's a woman called Tanya Verhovsky, who's a progressive state senator in Vermont, who's of Ukrainian heritage. And she's going to be speaking at a meeting at our House of Commons that we're organising with some of our supporters who are left-wing Labour Party MPs, and then she's going to be coming over to Brussels with us for there's a left Ukraine solidarity event. There were left Ukraine solidarity events going on in Brussels at the end of the month too. So we'll look forward to having Tanya over, and that will hopefully be a step in developing our transatlantic connections as well. But thank you again so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad Tanya's going over. She's a member of the Ukraine Solidarity Network, so some of us know her. I saw that Chris also just posted in the chat an interview that I did with Dennis Pilash with the Ukrainian socialist group Social Movement that appears in the journal Commons. It came out today, so you can check that out. So I hope everybody has a good week. As I keep saying, the way to resist Trump is not just online by yourself in your bedroom, but you got to get in a group and work together and learn from each other. And that will lift your spirits as well as your effectiveness. So,
Howie, one other thing, we're going to be demonstrating at the US Embassy on Wednesday. So if anyone in the States wants to send us messages of solidarity to read out when we're protesting outside your embassy, please do. We'd love that.
All right. You just gave me an assignment, and I hope others will send you something too. How do they send you a message if they want to?
You can send it to info@ukrainesolidarity.campaign.org. I'll put that in the chat. That would be absolutely great.
Okay, that should.
We had a very good demonstration on the 22nd of February with organised between ourselves, trade unions, UK trade unions, and progressive Ukrainian groups. We had, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 people demonstrating, marching to the Russian embassy. So a lot of people on demonstration. Even then, were talking about, we should be demonstrating at the US embassy. So after the events of yesterday, we decided to go ahead with doing that. So yeah, we're looking forward to doing that on Wednesday.
Yeah, that clip from Eva Pospisinska's speech was from that demonstration. And
That's
if you go to Ukraine Solidarity campaign, I believe that's where I got the speech clip from. So they
Yeah,
have,
a number of the videos are on there. From the
yeah, so you can see the demonstration, and it's encouraging. You know, we should be doing more of that in this country. So thanks again, Sacha, and everybody have a good week.
Take care. Thanks very much.